Coming up on the Threat Status podcast, we talk to Jesse Kallman, the founder and CEO of Danti, an artificial intelligence company that's breaking new ground in the national security space with its synthesis of geospatial and Earth observation data for defense and commercial use. John Seward is also on the show this week with a deep dive on the U.S. Army's own progress developing a game-changing new AI-integrated digital communications platform. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm Guy Taylor, the National Security Editor at the Washington Times, and I'll be hosting this week's episode while regular host Ben Wolfgang is away. What's exciting is that I'm joined this week by John Seward, one of the lead journalists on the Threat Status reporting team. We've also got a really interesting feature interview ahead with Jesse Kallman, the founder and CEO of Danti, an eye-opening artificial intelligence company, all about what that company is doing in its work with U.S. intelligence agencies, the Space Force, the Air Force, and how the fast-evolving world of AI is changing not only the way wars are fought, but how they're perceived, and just how deep the layers of satellite-based data flows run through today's global information landscape. So stay tuned for that interview with Jesse Kallman of the company Danti. But before we get there, John Seward, you've been reporting on the intersection between artificial intelligence and the future of U.S. Army combat quite a bit lately. Thanks for jumping on here for this episode. What's on your radar right now?
Yeah, thanks, Guy, for having me on. So as you know, I just spent a little over a week out in the Mojave Desert. The U.S. Army has a base in California, Fort Irwin, that hosts major training events in these war games. So I was actually there to take a look at the progress that's been made on the next generation command and control system, which is a mouthful. So folks have just taken to calling it NGC2. Basically, it's a wholesale replacement of a lot of the communications and data infrastructure for the Army, but it actually uses AI enabled tools to do this sort of predictive analysis. I talked to Major General Pat Ellis, the commander of the 4th Infantry Division, and his unit has been doing this sort of collaborative thing with the defense industry directly down to like the soldier level to build it over the last 10 months. It's a lot faster than people have built things in the past when we talk about defense land and procurement. But General Ellis told me that now the system can actually give them feedback on their chances of success based on like different decisions they'd make.
But what is it exactly? I mean, you're talking like this is like a new kind of iPhone-like device that every soldier has or every commander has that's connected to everything in a futuristic way.
Yeah, I mean that's the idea. So they're still deciding at what level people will have that little device, but you're exactly right. It looks like a cell phone that's mounted on a soldier's kit, right? Their equipment on the front of their chest, and they just flip it down, and it actually shows them the map where possible enemies would be, and gives a bunch of different data and feeds it all into this what they call a data layer, this big system to try to help them make these decisions. Ellis had this great quote. He said, quote, "The models aren't perfect, but then again, neither were the war games in the past where we were using dice and standing around a big map in the dirt, moving wooden blocks around." I think that really illustrates like this jump that they've taken. Like it's less than a year building outside the normal purchasing process. And they're literally pulling data from all over the battlefield, fuel, ammo, enemy positions, satellite imagery, all of it.
I mean, I know the answer to this because I actually edited your story in the last 24 hours. It's on the Washington Times website. People should check it out. It's an amazing feature that John wrote. There's a bunch in what you reported about AI integration into this futuristic new NGC2 communications platform that the U.S. military is adopting. So how does AI work in the
Yeah,
system?
I mean, so basically by pooling together all of that information I was talking about earlier, now a ton of different companies, there were 40 different contractors working out there to outside of the box, which is sort of the training area, but they were working on this software. And all of that software can now sit sort of on top of that big pool of information and use different models, machine learning, computer vision. A lot of basically what we would think of as modern computing in the AI age to help soldiers and commanders make decisions about what the best thing to do on the battlefield is.
So like it gives like risk assessments on like if you move over there, your chance of being killed is higher or lower, like that sort of thing.
Pretty close. I mean, one of the things that they have is what's called a COA, right? A course of action. And there's a tool built into the system right now called a COA analysis tool. And it kind of gives you a percentage chance of whether or not you'll be successful at what you want to accomplish on the battlefield, literally taking the guesswork out of getting down and dirty in the fight and trying to move things off of the battlefield. Some of the folks that I talked to out in the field literally called it the God calculator because of how it was predicting what they would and wouldn't be able to do.
Fort Irwin is in the Mojave Desert. Like, how hot was it when you were out there? And like, does this stuff actually work in the heat?
So this was you're pointing it out perfectly. Like, this was the hurdle that I think a lot of people seem to acknowledge. Obviously, all of that AI capability we just talked about was the goal, and they purchased a lot of off the shelf equipment to start to get into that space and to test it and to make it work and build the system. So you actually had some parts, some important parts, really overheating pretty badly. I talked to one of the company commanders, and she was actually down on the line doing the fighting. She said she had systems shut off because of the heat, had batteries that just refused to work, even though they were fully charged, basically being dead weight for her soldiers as they were going into the fight. But Ellis, he pointed out a kind of interesting anecdote. He said, I don't know that we need to ruggedize everything to be ready for this heat. He talked about seeing a soldier take a spare t-shirt out of like an ice chest with water on it and drape that over a Starlink terminal to cool it down so that it would keep running. But the heat was an issue. I mean, it didn't get below 110 the entire time, midday that I was out there. So it is something that they're going to have to consider and work through. But the challenge is not leaning too much into sort of this gold plating, right? Making it perfect for every scenario and just skyrocketing that price for all this equipment.
Interesting.
Ultimately, the system is going to have to go through a little bit more development, but the leadership at the Army has decided that it's moving on to the next phase, which means it's actually going to go from 4th Infantry Division up to I Corps, which is their higher headquarters, to start proliferating out to the Army and continue testing.
Well, the intersection of AI and national security is actually also going to be on display next week, as you know, John, at the annual Space and Missile Defense Symposium in Huntsville, Alabama. Threat Status at the Washington Times has created a special Operation Huntsville project, and we will have a multimedia team of journalists on the ground at the Space and Missile Defense Symposium. We're going to be doing exclusive video interviews with a slew of top U.S. military officials. We'll be tracking the latest of the space-based layer of President Trump's signature multi-billion-dollar Golden Dome missile shield project. We'll also be traveling around Huntsville for exclusive visits to several major U.S. defense contractors that work in that arena, and really just highlighting how Huntsville, Alabama, which hosts U.S. Space Command at Redstone Arsenal, has emerged as a major industrial hotspot for the design and manufacture of some of the most advanced and futuristic rocket and space-related U.S. defense technologies. I digress on that for now. Please stay tuned for our coverage in the Daily Threat Status newsletter over the coming week. John, I'm separately tracking the dangerous escalation in the Russia-Ukraine war as that conflict churns violently through its 5th summer. I've actually been on the phone a few times this week with Guillaume Patak, the Threat Status special correspondent based in Kyiv. It's become a kind of forever war for Russia. A couple of sad developments in recent days saw Ukrainian and Russian military forces carrying out strikes that have targeted and obliterated major commercial distribution centers like the Russian and Ukrainian versions of Amazon type distribution warehouses, both in and around Kyiv, but also deep inside Russia. Russian forces appear to be ramping up missile strikes targeting civilian infrastructure in the Ukrainian capital. At the same time, overnight from August 5 to August 6, the Ukrainians claim to have successfully hit several oil refinery sites deep inside Russia with drone attacks. All the while, John, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky continues to plead on the world stage for more U.S. and European shipments of counter missile defense systems, particularly Patriot missile batteries and replacements of ones that the Ukrainians have already fired. These things have been depleted badly on the world stage as the other major war in the Middle East also continues to churn. Last week on the podcast, I highlighted the prospect of a convergence between the Russia-Ukraine war and the U.S.-Israel war with Iran, now the U.S.-Israel-Saudi Arabia war with Iran and its proxies, by the way, into a kind of single world war-like conflict. And that was my thread of the week on the podcast last week. In recent days, the narrative of such a convergence has continued to emanate from top U.S. national security experts. Threat Status's own Mike Glenn attended a discussion in recent days with retired U.S. Air Force Lieutenant General Thomas Bergeson, the former deputy commander of U.S. Central Command, who argued that the lines separating these wars are starting to blur. With the close tactical relationship between Russia and Iran undergirding concerns of a widening multinational war. As for the question of whether or not the Trump administration and the Iranians are actually engaged in a real peace negotiation over the Strait of Hormuz, at this point, it remained an open question as we taped this episode on August 6th. I think there's hope of some kind of breakthrough, but we haven't seen it yet, and the threat of escalation and another forever war type situation continues to loom. Interestingly, the magazine Foreign Affairs published an argument on August 6th by Corey Shockey of the American Enterprise Institute, who asserts that it's not too late for the Trump administration to try and engage aspects of the so-called Powell Doctrine, to try and right the ship with regard to the ongoing U.S. strategy towards this conflict with Iran. Of course, the Powell Doctrine, named after the late Joint Chiefs Chairman Colin Powell, stipulates that the U.S. should only use military force as a last resort. It also stipulates that the question of whether there is a plausible exit strategy must be addressed before the use of such force commences in order to avoid endless entanglement. Jesse Kallman is the founder and CEO of Danti, an artificial intelligence company that's headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia, and has come onto our threat status radar because of its work with the U.S. national security community, particularly its contracts with the Pentagon, the U.S. Air Force, the Space Force. Jesse Kallman's career prior to founding Danti has spanned the drone, space, geospatial, and broader aerospace and defense industry. Jesse, thank you for coming on the Threat Status podcast.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Tell us first, what is Danti and what exactly does the company do?
Sure. So we started Danti back in 2023, really to focus on the problem of the sheer volume and complexity of information being generated, but typically tied to physical locations somewhere in the world. And this sort of gap between the amount of analysts out there that truly understood how to work with this stuff every day, and the gap between them and the other 98% of the world that was just looking to get their questions answered. And so at Danti, what we've built is infrastructure that helps organizations connect highly disparate, disconnected, multimodal data systems. And then we provide essentially AI analysts that can run in the background, that understand tradecraft, they understand how to work across agencies, across data types, across data silos, so that an end user in the field who is just looking to get a question answered about a maritime situation somewhere in the world, border conflicts, just any kind of event somewhere in the world can pose their question, get simple answers fast, and also helping alleviate a lot of the manual and sort of context building work that analysts have to do every day, when their time should really be spent focusing deep and analyzing deep problems for those end users.
You're working with the U.S. government. Danti has a contract with the Space Force. What can you tell us about that contract? I don't know, but I imagine it's not a classified contract, right? What are you doing with the Space Force?
Our work with the Space Force, we actually, and maybe just to take a step back, like we've done work now across a number of different federal agencies, both in the intelligence community, Department of Defense. We've announced organizations like National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, U.S. Space Force, Air Force, work with SOCOM and others. But specifically on our work with U.S. Space Force, we actually met them through an initial program at NGA where we were doing a lot of work on how does the U.S. better share unclassified information with its allies and partners in times of natural disasters or where the U.S. needs to collaborate with its allies during some sort of ongoing operation somewhere in the world, where today a lot of that data tends to, even if it's commercial and unclassified, tends to make its way to classified networks, therefore making it classified and very difficult to share. And so our work with the U.S. Space Force was focused on a program called TAC SRT. And this is a really interesting and unique program where they're bringing a lot of unclassified commercial data together to support, again, a lot of U.S. partners and allies around the world or parts of the Defense Department that are looking for completely open, unclassified information quickly that can either supplement what they're getting from more of the traditional classified intelligence apparatus, where they can take this information, they can use it openly, share it with partners, and it's just a completely new take on the power of commercial data and what it can do. And so we've been supporting that program now for about 2.5 years. We're used by a lot of their internal analysts within the Space Force. When they get requests for information, they leverage Danti to type that question in and rapidly understand the information landscape around them and around what that end user is trying to do. And now, as part of that program, a lot of those end users directly use Danti, where today they can now even self-serve a lot of those questions themselves without even needing to submit that request for information. And so,
well, I want to get into the granularities because I was pretty blown away by some of the stuff that you showed me from a Danti demo about things like commercial satellite verification of Russian missile defense positions in Crimea. Is the proliferation of satellite images and other open source information about micro developments in conflict, troop movements, construction of new facilities, do you see that as changing the way wars are being fought, or is it changing the public or government narratives around the information about conflict?
I think it is. I think the world has changed a lot in the last 5, even 10 years, but even more so the last few years, right? The proliferation of just commercial information, and you can see this in Ukraine, like the amount of information that's just on X every day, right? What's happening and drone attacks and doing battle damage assessments via X, right? Like that is a commonplace thing today. And I think sometimes people will see satellite imagery or a lot of these other things that are now very commonplace in the news, right? If there's an attack in Iran, usually the first thing you see on the front page or any publication out there is essentially what the U.S. government used to do with national technical means. It's on the front page of the Washington Post or the New York Times. Is just satellite imagery verifying things. So I think the problem though is that it's what type of information is key to answer the thing that you're after, and how do you use them all interchangeably. And so, but I do think the amount of commercial information out there is really changing how special operations teams conduct their work, how the U.S. engages with a lot of its partners. There's so much value in what's happening in the commercial side.
Well, we're in this, like, people call it the digital dark age because there's so much information. I talk to common Americans all the time and they say there's just too much information. I don't even know what's that. And you're talking about actual fact-based, verified, really valuable, the good stuff. I want to bring John Seward in. Sorry, John. I know he's like pining to ask a question.
No, I mean, obviously, I think this is fascinating, right? Because Jesse, as you pointed out, so much of this conversation is already happening publicly, and it's things that throughout most of the war on terror, like we saw this as the government's edge a lot of times, right? Like, as you put it, technical, tactical means. I do want to ask though, like, I want to ask about what are y'all's primary data sources, and like, how are y'all verifying some of that? I think we know at this point with a lot of large language models, machine learning models, that you kind of get garbage in, garbage out. So like, how are you guys managing that problem set?
It's a great question. So, the AI models are as good as what you feed them, and they're as good as what they're trained on, right? And so, and also to the prior question about, what types of information and like overload, right? I think it's all connected. There's kind of this data deluge problem where we just have way too much, right? And it's not just about feeding the right data to the right model. It's about how do I, as a user, without deep subject matter expertise in any one of these areas, get the right context based on the problem at hand. And what that requires is models that deeply understand the data at hand, where it came from, is it a trusted source or not? And so you have the actual like data provenance there to know where it came from, what model it was fed, right? But really, what really matters is getting to that end user who doesn't care really about a lot of the how it, what's going on behind the scenes, but this is the key pieces of information, so I'm not overloaded with too much information. It came from a trusted source. It came from XYZ government server, and it's the piece of information I need to answer my question. And I think that's the key piece here is right context, right time, but I can actually verify where that data came. And you're using the AI models in pieces of a sequence. It's not all about the AI models. And I think that's one of the things we hear the most, right, is, yeah, why can't I just throw this at Claude and do the work I need to do? And actually, our head of machine learning, sometimes he'll get very animated in these calls, and he's like, "Pull it up, try to run a SIGINT workflow in Claude right now. I'll wait." And then the customer laughs, and then they start to understand, like, yeah, this is not a problem of throwing a bunch of data at a model and getting an output. It's an actual concentrated effort to orchestrate large language models, small models, classical machine learning, knowledge graph infrastructure in this sort of harness that can bring together all of this mess of information that's out there to like just the key pieces of information that you need as a user based on your problem.
I want to keep digging on that because I feel like I have so many questions, but but like one of the key questions that strikes me when you describe that, because you're perfectly right? Like that conversation of, hey, pull up signals intelligence on Claude, like that's just not even a possibility right now. But for y'all to be able to work in that structure, how are you getting to sort of like a ground truth? I mean, one of the things I noticed on the website was having common time and space anchors for a lot of the information. So how are you translating all this disparate data into something a little bit more usable for those kinds of process?
Our bread and butter as a company is really about that spatial temporal context, because a lot of AI systems are really great at just broad scale text and understanding that. And so what we try to focus on as a company is based on the intent of the user, we try to ground everything at least to one or several points somewhere in the world and a time frame, right? And a lot of what our users are looking at are like how something is evolving over time, or an event that may trigger some other action based on something that happens in this one location. We need to take another action in this other location. And so everything tends to root itself in time and place. And we've had to build a lot of interesting technologies to understand like named entities and problems. And like, for example, this came up recently, with an analyst talking about Georgia. Did they mean Atlanta, Georgia, or the Republic of Georgia?
Sure.
And
Right.
they gave
Yeah.
a vague, event. And are you talking about the one from 2 years ago, or are you talking about the one from 2 months ago? Right. And how do you assume the intent of the user to say, no, it's the Republic of Georgia and it's from 2 months ago? Because we know that you as an operator are not, you're more focused in the now than historical looks, right? And so how do you build that into an intelligent system that can understand that spatial temporal context from a user?
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. I feel like though there's got to be just this massive challenge of being able to place a lot of this open source information in time and space, like you're talking about, right? Like you brought up this example of events in the Republic of Georgia, like just being able to do that split. How are you guys working through that problem? Is that like a bunch of compute on your end that you're paying for to do a lot of data labeling, or is that more of a digesting and a process for your system? Like where's the bridge there?
Yeah, a lot of that, it's not really a data labeling problem. It's more of a understanding context problem
Okay.
and understanding intent, right? Because every user's intent is different. It's also a problem of what does accuracy and relevancy mean, right? That's a big topic for a lot of the users, because what you might find accurate is very different from what someone else may find accurate based on their intent and the context of their problem. So this is like, a lot of people see AI demos and, you type some stuff in and some cool stuff comes out, but there are so many edge cases and use cases. So a lot of, you're asking kind of like what's under the hood. And a lot of it is just like learning over hundreds and hundreds of thousands of queries and intents and trying to understand like what is true relevance and accuracy to this person versus that person, and making sure that you can cast a wide enough net so that when you do ask that question about, potential operations in Georgia, based on this type of user and their past history, this is the most likely relevant thing for that type of user, so that you're introducing the right data, right time, right context for them.
Okay, gotcha. So it's more focused on that user end.
A lot of what we do is really tied to the end user. Yeah. Like how much time can we spend to that user? And then how does that user compare to a much broader set of users, so that the next person that comes into the system gets the benefit of the learning from a lot of the prior interactions with the system.
Jesse, does Danti have private clients that could be feeding information that the company harnesses to U.S. non-state or state adversaries? Is that a concern? How do you protect the information from flowing into the wrong hands?
Yeah, this is not like a open system that you can just get accounts off the open internet, right? And so like the instance of the system, you can think of Danti like nodes, right? So different parts of the government will have a node, right? It's a way to make data that, for example, a government would be spending millions of dollars on data in this one part of one organization. The other part has no idea, but we do protect that information within each organization's node, and they have the complete control and ability to decide who has access to that. What searches can this show up in? Do we want to expose this to any other nodes, or is this going to be tightly controlled in just this one part of the organization? And we actually have to do a lot of work for things like role-based access control, fine-grained access control at a data level, and just ensuring that that's completely controlled and locked down to those organizations. So,
I mean, you're essentially talking about cybersecurity to a degree. Are you at all worried about cybersecurity? And specifically, are you worried about data poisoning and the threat of outside influence making the information that Danti harnesses unreliable? How are you securing that so operators are not getting fed bad raw data?
I mean, that's a really important point, right? Like if you have a team of analysts somewhere and you want to make sure that those analysts that, for example, part of our system can auto generate briefings and reporting, and you can monitor a situation somewhere in the world and say, hey, instead of 4 analysts having to work the night shift to brief the commander at 8 a.m. when they get in, you can have an AI system that generates that brief. But what's feeding that brief, right? What if that brief on something going on in Russia is being fed a bunch of Russian propaganda that's totally incorrect? And so how we think about it is the notion of sort of trusted sources. And like you guys brought up that sort of like data source provenance point earlier, but the sort of concepts of trusted sources and what sources are used in a sort of generation of a report, we provide, just like an analyst would, inline sourcing within the system. We provide a full summary of sources at the bottom, just like an analyst would say, this top line summary paragraph was generated by these exact sources. This is where they came from, and this is the data that was used and where it came from. And you can also tell the system what sources you like and what you don't like. So if you want to keep Russian media out of it, you can keep it on the side. You can still look at it, but it won't be used in any sort of generative process.
Jesse Kallman, the CEO and founder of Danti, pretty interesting company to pay attention to. Thank you for coming on the Threat Status Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here on the show where we each identify a threat, whether it's here in the United States, on the domestic front, or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting or could soon be impacting U.S. national security. John, what do you have as your threat of the week?
So you heard us talk a little bit about this in our interview with Jesse, but my threat of the week is AI poisoning and data poisoning. I mean, basically, the more that we involve these large AI systems in the government, I mean, we talked about it with the Army's new system, the more that these state level adversaries like Russia and China are going to try to look for a way to feed those systems bad information at the source. That's a huge impact down the line because effectively the AI models are living in a fantasy world if that happens. So nothing they produce can be trusted. I'm watching it especially because it seems like some of our ability to compartmentalize information, which is sort of basically how we keep things classified, is breaking down a little as we try to give these massive AI data sets access to more information.
For my threat of the week, John, I'm going back to something I hit on basically every month on the podcast here. And that is the sobering reality that there are no nuclear nonproliferation talks occurring among the world's great powers in 2026. The Strategic Nuclear Arms START treaty has expired. China, the U.S., and Russia are all making nuclear weapons moves. NBC News had an exclusive this week reporting that there's actually an active push inside the Pentagon to draft a new U.S. nuclear strategy in case of a war with China or Russia. These are sobering times, and that's my threat of the week. And with that, thank you so much, John Seward, for being here this week and all the great reporting that you do for our team at Threat Status. And a big thanks to Jesse Kallman for taking us deep inside the workings of Danti, the AI company that he founded and leads. But most of all, thanks to all of you, our listeners. Please go ahead and hit that subscribe button, share with all your friends, and we will be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.